Apple hung a billboard at the Consumer Electronics Show in January 2019. Giant, unmissable. What happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone. Privacy, that's iPhone. Tim Cook had been saying for years that privacy is a fundamental human right, that Google's business model treated users as a product, that the kind of company that data mines your search history and sells your attention to advertisers is exactly the kind of company Apple was not. And at that exact same moment, Google was wiring over $1 billion a month to Apple to stay inside your phone's search bar. That is not an exaggeration, that is not a theory, that is what came out under oath in a federal courtroom. And the deeper you look at how this deal actually worked, the worse Apple's privacy story gets, because the number is not just enormous, it is also the number Apple's own executive admitted he loses sleep over. Let's go through this properly, because this is one of the most brazen contradictions in modern tech history, and most people still do not know the full picture. The deal between Apple and Google has been in place since 2002. It started as nothing. Google was just the default search engine on Safari, no money exchanged. But as the iPhone became the most coveted device in the world, and Safari became the browser sitting in hundreds of millions of pockets, Google started paying, and paying, and paying. By May 2021, Google was transferring more than $1 billion a month to Apple, every single month, to stay in the search bar, to be the thing that loads when you tap that little magnifying glass on your iPhone and type something into the box. In 2022 alone, Google paid Apple an estimated $20 billion for that placement. $20 billion. Confirmed under oath by Eddie Q, Apple's senior vice president of services, during the Department of Justice antitrust trial against Google. Not leaked, not estimated by analysts, confirmed in a federal courtroom by one of Apple's own executives. But that is only the beginning of what the court revealed. The figure that actually made Google's lawyers react was not the $20 billion, it was the percentage. During the trial, Google's own expert witness, a University of Chicago economics professor testifying on Google's behalf, accidentally disclosed in open court that Apple receives 36% of all search advertising revenue Google earns through Safari. 36 cents of every dollar Google makes when an iPhone user searches something and Google serves them an ad. The percentage had been protected by non-disclosure agreements. It was classified financial information that both companies had fought to keep out of public view, and it slipped out by mistake. Google's lead attorney visibly cringed when it happened. The next day, under oath at a separate trial, Google's own CEO Sundar Pichai confirmed it was accurate. Think about what that number means in practice. If Apple was receiving $20 billion and that equates to 36% of Safari search ad revenue, then Google was generating roughly $56 billion a year from people searching on iPhones and Macs. Google kept $36 billion. Apple got $20 billion. For doing nothing except making sure Google was the default option every time you opened Safari, Apple did not build a search engine. It did not index the web. It did not design an ad auction. It just kept the door open, and it collected 36% of everything that walked through. That is not a partnership. That is a toll booth on your attention. And here is the part that makes it worse. The payment did not just represent profit. In 2020, the Google payment alone represented 17.5% of Apple's entire operating income. Nearly 1/5 of the privacy company's profits that year came directly from the world's largest advertising and surveillance engine, the same engine Tim Cook had stood in front of Congress to criticize, the same model he called a threat to human dignity. Apple was collecting a cut of it. Now, Apple will say users can change the default search engine in Safari settings. They can switch to Bing, to Yahoo, to DuckDuckGo, to Ecosia. The option is there. And technically, that is true. It exists. But this is where Apple's privacy story stops being about philosophy and starts being about price. Because the financial value of the deal is entirely built on the fact that almost no one changes the default. Apple and Google both knew that. Every economist who testified at the trial knew that. The entire $20 billion arrangement only makes sense if the vast majority of iPhone users never go into settings and switch. The choice screen is not a feature. It is a legal defense dressed up as user control. DuckDuckGo understood this better than anyone. DuckDuckGo built its entire search business around privacy and non-tracking the exact values Apple's billboard campaign was selling. They wanted to be in that default slot, They never got close to it. The company's VP of Public Affairs publicly stated that Google had put a stranglehold on major distribution points for over a decade, making it unduly difficult for privacy-focused alternatives to gain users. And that is precisely accurate. DuckDuckGo cannot improve its search results without more users. It cannot gain more users without default placement. It cannot compete for default placement because Apple is being paid $20 billion a year not to give it to them. This is not a failure of DuckDuckGo's product. It is a structural lock. And a federal court confirmed it. In August 2024, U.S. District Court Judge Amit Mehta ruled that Google had illegally maintained its search monopoly. The ruling specifically named Google's exclusionary agreements with Apple and other device makers as creating steeper anti-competitive effects. The deal blocked rivals from key distribution channels. The court confirmed in writing what privacy researchers, antitrust economists, and frustrated users had been saying for years. This arrangement was not competition. It was a monopoly maintained by payments. Apple's response to that ruling? Its stock went up 3.5%. That is the humiliation. A federal judge confirmed the deal Apple benefited from was part of an illegal monopoly. The stock market celebrated. Wedbush securities analyst Dan Ives called it a monster win for both Apple and Google because the ruling, despite its findings, did not ban the payments. The judge rejected the DOJ's request to prohibit Google from paying for default placement. Google can still write the check. Apple can still cash it. The only change is that Google must now rebid its default contracts annually instead of locking them in for longer terms. The structure that froze out DuckDuckGo and Brave is still largely intact. Legal. Named. Rewarded. Welcome to big tech accountability. Meanwhile, Microsoft had tried to break into that default slot years earlier. Court documents revealed that Microsoft offered Apple 90% of Bing's advertising revenue. They even offered to hand Bing to Apple entirely, and Eddie Q testified under oath that there was no price in the world Microsoft could offer that would justify switching to Bing. He said Google delivered stronger results and a better monetization engine. Apple's search deal was so deeply embedded in its services revenue model that even a near total revenue share from Microsoft could not compete with what Google was offering. That alone tells you how good the deal was for Apple, and how completely the default slot had become untouchable. But then something changed, and the change exposed exactly what the deal had always really been about. In May 2025, Eddie Q was back in court, this time in the remedies phase of the Google antitrust case. And he testified that Safari search volume had dropped for the first time in 22 years. In April 2025, people were searching less through Safari. Q attributed it to AI tools, ChatGPT, Perplexity, Anthropic's Claude. People were starting to ask questions elsewhere, not in a search bar, but in a chat window. The model Apple and Google had been running together for 2 decades was developing the first crack, and Q said he had lost sleep over it. Lost sleep. Over the possibility of losing Google's payment. Not over users getting a worse experience. Not over the privacy implications of the arrangement. Over the revenue. The privacy company's most senior services executive admitted in federal court that the potential loss of a surveillance-funded advertising payment was keeping him awake at night. That is what the deal was always really about. Not quality. Not the best search experience for users. Revenue. The services business Apple built to impress Wall Street was materially dependent on a check from the company Apple's own CEO had publicly criticized for treating users as a product. Privacy researchers had been writing about this contradiction for years. Publications called it out explicitly. Forum threads on Reddit and Blind lit up every time new financial details surfaced from the trial. Users who had switched from Android partly because of Apple's privacy pitch described discovering the Google deal's true scale as a trust-breaking moment. Not a footnote, not a technical detail. A fundamental reframing of what Apple was and what it had actually been building. And then, in January 2026, Apple made it worse. Apple and Google announced a multi-year partnership. Google's Gemini AI models will power Apple Intelligence. Gemini will power Siri. The voice assistant Apple has spent years telling you is private, on-device, and designed to keep your personal information away from the data economy is now being built on top of infrastructure from the world's largest advertising company. This is not a search bar anymore. This is the AI layer, the thing that reads your screen, the thing that understands context across your apps, the thing that interprets what you mean when you ask it something and routes your requests to get you an answer. And now the underlying intelligence doing that interpretation is trained by Google and licensed from Google. Apple says its private cloud compute system maintains privacy standards even with Gemini-powered features. That is Apple's stated position, and the privacy architecture they describe may have real technical substance. But here is the question that does not have a clean answer yet. How fully can a privacy standard apply to a model that was trained by the world's largest advertising data company on data collected from the world's largest advertising ecosystem? That is not a simple question, and Apple has not given a simple answer. What makes this worse is why the Gemini deal happened at all. Apple's own Siri AI development had been slipping. Features promised at WWDC 2024 did not ship. Timelines slipped again through 2025. According to reporting, Apple was losing AI talent at a serious rate. Senior researchers leaving for Meta, for OpenAI, for Anthropic. The foundation models team at Apple was reportedly small, underfunded relative to competitors, and getting smaller. The company that charges over $1,200 for a phone could not build the AI it had promised users, so it went to Google, the company it built its privacy brand against. Reports from Bloomberg had earlier suggested Apple was exploring buying Perplexity AI, a smaller, privacy-friendlier AI search startup. That would have been a very different signal. Instead, Apple signed a multi-year agreement with Google. According to reporting from The Information, the deal is reportedly deeper than the public announcement suggested. Apple has access to Gemini model weights inside its own data centers and can distill smaller custom models from them for on-device use. That means Google's AI infrastructure is not just present at the cloud layer, it is seeding the models that run directly on your phone. And the timing could not be more pointed. The DOJ and multiple states appealed the judge's 2025 remedies ruling in February 2026, seeking stricter fixes to the monopoly the court had already confirmed. Google simultaneously appealed the 2024 monopoly finding itself, arguing it earned its position through merit and innovation. Oral arguments are unlikely before late 2026 or 2027. The case could reach the Supreme Court. While that process grinds forward, the two companies just announced a new contract, deepening the commercial relationship regulators are trying to reduce. The DOJ is trying to break them apart. Apple is signing deals to pull them closer. That is not speculation. That is the timeline. Brave had been growing. DuckDuckGo had surpassed 50 million downloads. Users were looking for the exit. They were growing their own alternatives, not because Apple or Google made room for them, but in spite of the structural lock that the court confirmed and mostly left intact. Privacy-conscious users had been building towards something different. They were there, in the settings menu, invisible by design. DuckDuckGo, Brave, Ecosia. The actual implementations of the privacy Apple was advertising, right there in a drop-down list that most users never open, waiting while Apple negotiated the next billion-dollar deal with the company that funds its services growth. Here is what is important to say clearly. Apple does real privacy work. App tracking transparency genuinely changed how apps behave on iOS. Private Relay is a real feature. On-device processing for many AI tasks is a real commitment. Apple collects less data about you than Google does. That is real, and it matters. The contradiction is not that Apple does nothing for privacy. The contradiction is that the first thing every iPhone user does, typing something into a search bar, generates advertising revenue for Google, and Apple takes 36 cents of every dollar that produces, while running campaigns about how much it cares about your information. The privacy was real in Apple's lane. The surveillance was fully operational in Google's lane, and Apple was paid to keep that lane open, to keep it as the default, and to ensure almost no one ever wandered into settings to close it. That is the part Apple never put on a billboard. Analysts are now watching the new Gemini deal as a potential flashpoint in the ongoing antitrust proceedings. Legal experts have noted that it deepens the very entanglement regulators are trying to reduce. The late 2025 ruling limited Google's exclusive default search contracts to annual renewals, but the AI partnership creates a second pipeline that operates under different legal framing. Regulators are still working out what it means. In the meantime, Every new iPhone shipped in 2026 arrives with Google in the search bar and Google's AI model in the intelligence layer. The system caught it. The system named it. The system left it largely in place. And then Apple hired Google to run Siri. The real question is not whether Apple cares about your privacy. It does, in the ways it controls. Some of what it built is genuine and worth defending. But the question that the court record, the accidental disclosures, the lost sleep testimony, and the January 2026 AI deal all point toward is a different one. It is whether privacy was ever meant to describe the whole system or just the parts of the system Apple owns while quietly building its services revenue on the parts it doesn't. You switched from Android because Apple said it respected your data. You were right that Apple handles its own data more carefully. But the search engine waiting for you every time you opened a browser was funded by an ad model that turns your queries into targeting signals. Apple got paid every time. They just made sure the math stayed confidential until a federal court got involved. The billboard said your iPhone was private. The court documents said someone was being paid very well for it not entirely to be.